a woman named Greta Evans travels to the United Kingdom after being employed as a nanny by a wealthy family. Upon her arrival, she promptly removes her shoes and explores the grand mansion in the absence of the owner. To her surprise, she is greeted by a man named Malcolm, who is a local delivery man and a frequent visitor. Malcolm kindly invites Greta for a tour of the house. Shortly after, an elderly woman named Mrs. Heelshire, the wife of the house owner, arrives. Mrs. Heelshire inquires about Greta's shoes, and Greta points out where she had taken them off, only to find them missing. Mrs. Heelshire casually suggests that her son may be responsible for their disappearance. She then invites Greta to meet her husband, Mr. Heelshire, and introduces her to the boy she is expected to care for. However, Greta is taken aback when she realizes that the boy is actually a porcelain doll named Brahms. Initially thinking it to be a joke, Greta laughs, but Mrs. Heelshire and Mr. Heelshire appear serious. Mrs. Heelshire explains that many nannies had applied for the position, but Brahms rejected them because they were neither young nor beautiful. The Heelshires proceed to instruct Greta on how to care for Brahms, providing her with a set of strict rules to follow. These rules include reading to Brahms in a clear and loud voice, playing loud music for him, storing leftovers in the refrigerator, setting a mousetrap, and giving Brahms a goodnight kiss. Mrs. Heelshire informs Greta that Brahms is shy and only moves when no one is watching. Subsequently, Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire consult Brahms for his opinion on Greta. Feeling unsettled by the situation, Greta observes as Mr. Heelshire closes the door for privacy. After a brief period, they emerge and inform Greta that Brahms likes her and wants her to babysit him. Greta contacts her sister to share the details of her encounter in the house. The next day, Greta overhears Mrs. Heelshire expressing her anger as it is revealed that Brahms has made a mess of his room. Shortly after, Mr. Heelshire informs Greta that they will be going on vacation, leaving her alone with Brahms. Mr. Heelshire provides Greta with a schedule for the upcoming days. Once they depart, Greta starts to disregard the rules and leaves Brahms unattended. During the night, Greta is awakened by strange noises and she immediately investigates their source. While standing in front of a painting, suddenly, a hand emerges from the wall, seemingly attempting to strangle her. However, it turns out to be just a nightmare. Greta then decides to check Brahms' room and notices tears welling up in his eyes. Upon further inspection, she discovers that the ceiling is leaking. That night, Greta receives a mysterious phone call, but when she answers, there is no response. The following morning, Malcolm arrives to deliver groceries and Greta takes the opportunity to inquire about Brahms. Malcolm reveals that Brahms was once a real child and the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire. Unfortunately, Brahms perished in a house fire when he couldn't escape in time. The doll is merely a way for the family to cope with their loss. Malcolm then asks Greta out on a date for that evening, to which she agrees. Greta prepares for the date and while on the phone with her sister, she notices Brahms watching her, prompting her to close the door. As Greta continues to get ready, she is startled to discover that her hair has been cut and her dress and necklace are missing. In a panic, Greta frantically searches for her belongings and is enticed to the attic by peculiar noises. She climbs the ladder, but suddenly, the attic door closes on its own, trapping Greta inside. Malcolm arrives to pick up Greta, but despite her cries for help, he doesn't hear her and leaves. Greta, determined to find another way out, begins searching for an alternative solution. Suddenly, a massive shadow emerges in front of her, startling her to the point of fainting. The next morning, Greta regains consciousness and finds herself mysteriously released. She recounts the events of the previous night to Malcolm, discovering that the ladder can open and close on its own. Curious about Brahms, Greta questions Malcolm once again, and he reveals that there are two rumors surrounding him. In the town, some people sympathize with Brahms, remembering him as a good boy. However, others claim that he was evil. Later that night, Greta contacts her sister, who informs her that her abusive ex-boyfriend, Cole, has been attempting to locate her. Greta harbors a deep hatred for Cole, as she suffered a miscarriage due to his violence. After preparing for bed and brushing her teeth, Greta hears a strange noise coming from Brahms' room. She cautiously approaches and discovers the room in disarray, with papers scattered everywhere. Gently straightening Brahms' tilted head, she is startled when it moves on its own, only to realize it was just a nightmare. The following day, Greta enters Brahms' room and notices that he has changed his position. He sits with her schedule beside him, as if instructing Greta to follow and obey everything as planned. Shocked by this revelation, Greta rushes to her room and attempts to call her sister. Suddenly, the phone rings, and as Greta answers, she hears a child's voice commanding her to follow the rules. A shadow appears under the door, further emphasizing the presence of a child. Greta now realizes that the doll holds far more secrets than she initially imagined. The doll is alive. Greta proceeds to open the door and is greeted by a tray of sandwiches that Brahms has kindly prepared for her. In that moment, Greta experiences a mixture of emotions. She realizes that Brahms doesn't intend to harm her. He simply desires her attention. Wanting to share this revelation, she promptly contacts Malcolm and shares the news with him. However, to her disappointment, Malcolm doesn't take her seriously. In a subsequent scene, Mrs. and Mr. Heelshire are seen composing a letter addressed to Brahms. The letter conveys their inability to continue living with the person Brahms has become, and they declare that the girl now belongs to him. After completing the letter, both Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire fill their coats with rocks and tragically take their own lives. Greta, now understanding that Brahms is merely the spirit of an innocent young boy seeking care, begins to treat him kindly and fulfill the responsibilities entrusted to her. The following day, Malcolm arrives with a letter from Mrs. and Mr. Heelshire, and he invites Greta to go for a walk that evening. However, Greta feels a sense of responsibility towards Brahms and declines Malcolm's invitation. Disappointed, Malcolm departs. Greta is then surprised to witness Brahms moving on his own, demonstrating his ability to change locations. The next day, Greta requests Malcolm's presence to prove that Brahms is indeed alive. Initially, she struggles to provide evidence as the doll only moves when unobserved. Consequently, she leaves the doll alone, and it begins to move. Eventually, Malcolm becomes convinced of Greta's claims. That night, Malcolm stays with Greta, and they spend time together. However, their activities are interrupted by Brahms, who appears to be experiencing jealousy. Subsequently, Greta and Malcolm engage in a conversation in the kitchen. During this exchange, Malcolm reveals a more detailed account of Brahms' death, cautioning Greta about her growing attachment. According to Malcolm's knowledge, when he was a child, Brahms used to play with a girl named Emily Cribbs, who was the same age as him. On Brahms' 8th birthday, Emily went to play with him at the Heelshire mansion and never returned. The lifeless body of the young girl was later uncovered in the dense forest, her skull brutally crushed. By the time the police arrived at the grand mansion to interrogate the young boy, the entire structure was already engulfed in flames, and Brahms was later discovered dead. This series of events led Malcolm to deduce that the malevolent spirit of Brahms, which resided within the doll, could potentially be responsible. The following morning, Greta's abusive ex-boyfriend, Cole, made an unwelcome appearance at the mansion, determined to coerce Greta into returning home. Concerned for Greta's safety, Malcolm remained close by. During the night, Greta sought assistance from the doll. Cole awoke to find a chilling message written in blood, instructing him to leave. Convinced that either Greta or Malcolm was behind it, he became enraged. Despite Greta's attempts to explain that Brahms was the true culprit, using rat blood to create the message, Cole stubbornly refused to believe her. Eventually, Malcolm joined them and also tried to convince Cole that there was more to the doll than met the eye. In a fit of anger, Cole destroyed the doll, causing the lights in the house to flicker and the entire structure to tremble. Strange noises emanated from within the walls, prompting Cole to investigate their source. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and Cole was thrown backward. Emerging from a hidden passage behind the broken mirror was a man who turned out to be the grown-up Brahms, wearing a porcelain mask identical to the doll's face. Brahms viciously attacked and killed Cole, leaving Greta and Malcolm terrified as they fled for their lives. In their search for safety, Greta and Malcolm stumbled upon Brahms' room, where they discovered a doll crafted from Greta's missing dress, hair, and jewelry resting on Brahms' bed. It became evident that Brahms had been observing Greta from this room all along. Additionally, Greta found a farewell letter from the Heelshires, which unveiled their plan to abandon Greta as a companion for Brahms. Just as they made this shocking discovery, Brahms found them. Brahms violently attacks Malcolm, threatening his life if Greta attempts to leave. Greta manages to escape the premises but ultimately returns to rescue Malcolm. Equipped with a screwdriver, she asserts her authority and compels Brahms to retire for the night. Brahms, seeking a goodnight kiss, makes an ill-fated move to embrace her, resulting in her retaliatory stab. Despite Brahms' attempt to strangle her, Greta persists, driving the weapon deeper until he collapses. Greta successfully saves Malcolm, and they flee from the house. The film concludes with a scene depicting Brahms reassembling the doll, implying his possible survival. Consequently, it becomes evident that Brahms never perished initially. He always harbored a disturbed nature, ultimately leading to the murder of Emily Cribbs on his 8th birthday. In order to protect him from the world, his parents set fire to their own home, feigning his demise and concealing him within the walls of their grand estate. This revelation sheds light on the reasons behind Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire's tragic suicide. Over time, their guilt outweighed their love for their child, prompting them to end their own suffering. Additionally, the film subtly drops various hints throughout its duration, building up to a significant revelation. At the start of the movie, Mrs. Heelshire explicitly mentions Brahms' preference for loud music, indicating that it should be audible through the walls since he resides within them. The Heelshires also exhibit a strong aversion to vermin infestation, emphasizing the importance of keeping the mouse traps clean to prevent any mice from entering the walls. Mr. Heelshire further reveals that they save all uneaten food, which evidently serves as sustenance for Brahms. Mrs. Heelshire tells Greta that Brahms is shy and only moves when no one is watching. This shows that the doll was never actually moving on its own but was being moved by the real Brahms who lives in the walls.